1944, Inyokern, California. A 10-foot steel tube hangs beneath a Navy Corsair, and the ground crew cannot stop staring. It weighs 1,285 pounds. Its casing is oil well pipe pulled from the California dirt. 24 nozzles ring its base like the chambers of an oversized revolver. The pilot pulls the release. A lanyard snaps taut. 30,000 pounds of thrust erase the silence. This is the story of the Tiny Tim, the largest air-to-ground rocket fielded by any Allied nation in the Second World War. A weapon so heavy it had to be dropped like a bomb before its motor could fire. So crude it was built from hardware meant for oil fields, and so powerful that its most devastating moment came against the wrong target. To understand why the Tiny Tim existed, you have to understand a problem that was killing American pilots over the Pacific. By 1943, the United States Navy had a gap in its air-to-ground firepower that no existing weapon could fill. Bombs worked against open targets, but Japanese forces were digging in. Concrete bunkers, reinforced cave positions, coastal fortifications sunk into coral and volcanic rock. A 500-pound bomb dropped from altitude scattered its energy across a wide blast radius. What the Navy needed was something that could deliver the punch of a bomb with the precision of a bullet, fired from an airplane at close range, fast enough that anti-aircraft gunners could not track it, and heavy enough to crack hardened positions from the outside in. The problem was physics. America already had air-to-ground rockets. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, the Holy Moses, could punch through light armor and was devastating against soft targets. But it weighed only 140 pounds. Against a reinforced bunker or the hull of a warship, it was a nuisance. To crack those targets, you needed a warhead the size of a bomb. And a warhead the size of a bomb required a motor powerful enough to throw it. And a motor that powerful required a body strong enough to contain the thrust without tearing itself apart at ignition. No American aircraft rocket had ever attempted anything this large. The engineering challenge was not simply to build a bigger rocket. It was to build one so heavy that existing launch systems could not fire it, and then invent a way to fire it anyway. A weapon that weighed more than half a ton, moving at 550 miles per hour, carrying enough explosive to gut a bunker from the inside. Every engineer who looked at the numbers reached the same conclusion. The motor would produce 30,000 pounds of thrust. Fire that from a wing rack, and the blast would destroy the airplane. Someone had to solve that problem, and the team that did it started with a piece of pipe. Charles Christian Lauritsen was born in Denmark in 1892, trained as an architect, and talked his way into Caltech's graduate physics program after attending a single lecture. By 1941, he was running Section L of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. The letter stood for his own name, and he had just returned from Britain with 40 British rockets and an urgent recommendation. America needed a rocket program. Caltech became that program. His deputy was William Fowler, a physicist who would later win the Nobel Prize. Together they built what Fowler called an $80 million war industry, with over 3,000 employees. But the Tiny Tim was not Charles Lauritsen's creation. It was his son's. Tommy Lauritsen, a Caltech physicist who served as projectile group supervisor at the Naval Ordnance Test Station, designed the weapon without official approval. The drawings were made in secret and presented to his supervisors in late December 1943 as a Christmas gift. Someone on the team, the name was never recorded, looked at the largest American rocket ever conceived and named it after the frailest character in English literature, Tiny Tim, the crippled child from Dickens. It was a joke. It stuck. The design was pure wartime pragmatism. Tommy Lauritsen did not invent new components. He repurposed existing ones. The body was 11 3/4 inches in diameter, not because that was the ideal size for a rocket, but because it matched standard oil well casing pipe already rolling off American steel mills. For the earliest prototypes, the team could not even get new pipe. They salvaged casings from abandoned oil wells in the California fields and machined them into rocket bodies. The warhead was an adapted 500-pound semi-armor-piercing bomb containing 148.5 pounds of TNT, designed to partially embed itself in a target before detonating. The motor used 4 modified Holy Moses propellant charges, cruciform-shaped sticks of ballistite, that burned through 24 exhaust nozzles arranged in 2 concentric rings around a copper safety disc. The multi-nozzle design was Tommy Lauritsen's obsession. A single large nozzle fed by 4 separate propellant grains could produce asymmetric thrust, sending the rocket tumbling. 24 small nozzles distributed the force evenly across all 4 charges. The result was 0.91 seconds of controlled fury, 30,000 pounds of thrust accelerating 1,285 pounds of steel, and explosive to 550 miles per hour. But the motor created a problem no one had solved before. You could not ignite 30,000 pounds of thrust while the rocket was bolted to a fighter. The blast would shatter the airframe. In August 1944, Lieutenant John Armitage was killed at Inyokern when shock waves from a Tiny Tim ignition tore his Helldiver apart. The airfield at China Lake was later named for him. His death forced a solution that was elegant in its simplicity. The Tiny Tim would be dropped like a bomb from a standard rack. A 3-foot lanyard connected the aircraft to the rocket's igniter. As the weapon fell, the lanyard stretched taut and snapped, triggering ignition only after the rocket had achieved safe separation. The airplane was already gone before the motor lit. By December 1944, the Tiny Tim was declared combat ready. Pilots trained at Inyokern, learning to release the weapon in a shallow dive and pull away before the lanyard fired. The rocket reached the fleet in early 1945, and 2 carriers received it first, USS Intrepid and USS Franklin. On both ships, Corsairs were armed with Tiny Tims slung beneath their bellies for strikes against Okinawa. On the morning of March 19, 1945, Franklin was operating 50 nautical miles off the Japanese coast, closer to the mainland than any American carrier had ventured during the war. 31 armed and fueled aircraft sat on the flight deck. Below, on the hangar deck, sailors stood in chow lines between ordnance carts loaded with Tiny Tim rockets. At 0707 hours, a single Japanese dive bomber dropped through the clouds and put 2 bombs into the ship. What followed was not a battle, it was a chain reaction. The bombs ignited fuel tanks, and the fuel ignited ordnance. 12 Tiny Tim rockets sat on the flight deck. 5 more waited on the hangar deck. The ballistite propellant in their motors ignites at just 325 degrees, well below the temperature of a gasoline fire. Commander Joseph Taylor, the executive officer, watched from the bridge as the rockets began to cook off. He later described what he saw. Tiny Tims flying in every direction, some to starboard, some to port, some straight up the flight deck, some tumbling end over end. Each time one fired, the firefighting crews hit the deck, then got back up and kept fighting. Taylor called it the most awful spectacle a human being had ever been privileged to see. A lot of these stories don't get told anywhere else. Subscribing helps make sure we can keep telling them. Now back to the Franklin. On the hangar deck, 4 of the 5 Tiny Tims detonated in the enclosed space. Of the men below, only 2 survived. The 5th rocket told a different story. Its motor fired and drove it 200 feet through the hangar, where the casing punched through an 1.25-inch armoured steel bulkhead. But the fuse required 300 to 500 feet of travel to arm. The rocket had not gone far enough. It lodged in the bulkhead, unexploded, and was not recovered until Franklin limped to Ulithi Atoll weeks later. 724 men died. Captain Leslie Gaius, a 6'5" former enlisted man they called Custer, refused to abandon ship. Franklin survived and travelled 12,000 miles home under her own power, the most heavily damaged fleet carrier to make it back. The honest truth about the Tiny Tim is that it barely fought the war it was built for. First combat use came on approximately April 24, 1945, less than 4 months before the Japanese surrender. The most sustained deployment was by VMB 612, a Marine Night Attack Squadron commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cram. His crews flew PBJ Mitchells modified to carry 2 Tiny Tims each, launching strikes from Okinawa against shipping in the East China Sea. The squadron expended more Tiny Tim rockets in training, firing at rocks on Iwo Jima, than they ever did in combat. Total combat sorties with the weapon, 10, the entire war. And accuracy was a persistent limitation. The rocket was unguided. It flew in a straight line from wherever it was pointed, and at 1,285 pounds, even small aiming errors translated to wide misses against point targets. Pilots learned through trial and error that optimal release was 1,350 yards from the target at 700 feet. But that limited record is not a mark against the weapon. It is evidence of what it actually was, a proof of concept. the first demonstration that a rocket the size of a bomb could be delivered from an airplane. Everything that came after began here. Within weeks of the Japanese surrender, the Tiny Tim motor found a second life that its creators never imagined. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory adapted it as the booster stage for the WAC Corporal, America's first sounding rocket. On October 11, 1945, at White Sands Proving Ground, a WAC Corporal riding a Tiny Tim booster reached approximately 70 kilometers altitude, roughly 43 miles straight up. The rocket, built from oil well pipe to crack bunkers in the Pacific, had carried an instrument package to the edge of space. The motor was more powerful than JPL had initially specified. The WAC Corporal climbed twice as high as planned. That was only the beginning. The institutional culture that Charles and Tommy Lauritsen built at China Lake during the war became the foundation for decades of American weapons development. William McLean, who had worked on proximity fuse for the same wartime organization that funded Lauritsen, began developing the AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missile at China Lake in the late 1940s. He initially called it a heat-homing rocket, language that reveals the direct lineage from the wartime program. The Sidewinder became the most produced and most copied air-to-air missile in history. After Sidewinder came Zuni, Shrike, Harm, and dozens more. Nearly every guided missile in the American inventory traces part of its heritage to what began at Inyokern with oil well pipe and ballistite. Charles Lauritsen was redirected to the Manhattan Project in late 1944, where his China Lake team built conventional explosive components for the atomic bomb. He later opposed the hydrogen bomb, served on more than 60 government advisory committees, and died in 1968. A laboratory at China Lake bears his name. Tommy Lauritsen returned to nuclear physics at Caltech and continued his father's research until his own death in 1973. Today, a cutaway Tiny Tim sits in the World War II Aviation Gallery at the Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center in Virginia. The 4 cruciform propellant sticks are simulated in wood and painted black. The 24 exhaust nozzles are still visible, still ringed around their copper safety disc, still looking like something that belongs in an oil field rather than a museum. 24 nozzles on a piece of pipe. That is what 30,000 pounds of thrust looked like in 1944. Crude, impossible, and just the beginning. Some weapons change the battlefield. The Tiny Tim changed what came after it. Here is a question for you. If you had been on the Caltech team in 1943 and you knew the war might end before your weapon ever saw combat, would you still have built it? Knowing what it would become, tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.